Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are going to study Genesis chapter 39 and chapter 40. And remember, we last left off where his brothers sold him into slavery, sold him to it was Ishmaelites who then carried Joseph to Egypt, and then he is bought by Potiphar, captain of the Egyptian guard. Joseph's story is one of the most fascinating stories. He is one of the most fascinating men in the Bible. I can only think of two men in the entire Bible, of course, other than Jesus, who could say that they did absolutely nothing wrong and yet suffered or was attacked. In other words, the Bible says that they did nothing wrong. Okay? I mean, Job comes close, but Job messes up at the end. Okay? But he still didn't do anything wrong to cause his suffering. But only two men, Daniel and Joseph. And so I'm combining these two chapters because we look at his journey now. His life has changed. And of course, what's interesting about Joseph is that his brothers, his own flesh and blood, sold him into slavery. His relatives, the Ishmaelites, carried him to Egypt and then sold him into the Egyptian, slavery. And at this time, in a sense, we don't remember this. There's no beef yet with Egypt, and as we're going to see, he is going to benefit Egypt immensely. We'll get to that, and then ultimately, of course, they're going to betray and enslave the descendants of Jacob. But so we're going to see that we're going to see his journey. It is a very fascinating journey, where he suffers for absolutely nothing that he does, doing good. He in other words, he did everything right. He does good. Even if we kind of go back to you could say he was a good son, right? And his brothers hated him and sold him. And we're going to see the same thing, that the good that he does becomes evil for him. But in the end, he's going to make a very astounding statement concerning all of this suffering that he does. In other words, he's not going to be bitter about it. That's very astounding that we're going to see about Joseph. He's not bitter, he's not angry, he's not hateful. Especially when he will be in a position that he could exact revenge and nothing would be said about it. All right, let's get into it. Now Joseph, verse 1, had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor in his master's sight and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he had owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian household because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. Verse 6, he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, let me just stop, because we kind of get the setup here with Joseph, that understand that And I'm going to say this as a sidebar. When we talk about the game of life, the game that we're in, how do we win? And Joseph now, his circumstances have changed, right? He was free, and now he's a slave. And he prospers because God was with him. So from the very beginning, we can see that Joseph is aware that God is with him. And he then acts accordingly. He acts with a perspective always towards God. And that's the key right there. It doesn't change the fact that he was wrong, that he was sold into slavery. But we're going to see constantly that his point of view, is always towards God. All right, verse 7 again. After some time, I'm going to read this last thing. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in his house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a thing, a great evil, and sin against God?" Now this is amazing because I want you to notice two things. He says, let me make the first one. Notice he says, "How can I sin against God?" In other words, in Joseph's view, the word godly, that's what really, when we say godly and godliness, this is what we mean. It is always a God-word attitude, that we always base everything that we see, our opinions, everything based upon God. Joseph probably could have got away with this adultery. He could have got away with it. Possibly, right? But he says, but notice his view was, how can I sin against God? Yeah, it would be against man, but first and foremost, I'm sinning against God. Now the other thing is that, notice that Joseph says this, that the only thing that he's withheld from me is you, come on, his wife. And that's telling, because why would he have to? In other words, why would he have to say, you can't have my wife? So, and obviously, what I'm going to say is that, to me, he would kind of have to know what kind of wife he has. All right, but let's go on. Verse 10, although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now, one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in his hand, he escaped and ran outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called the household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make a fool of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could, and when he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment with me and ran outside." So she put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. And she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave that you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment with me and ran outside." And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, these things your slave did to me. He was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. Now, I have to wonder, again, why did Potiphar not kill Joseph for that? Right? Think about that. And I have to wonder, if he kind of knew, even though that he, again, to me, he would have to have known what kind of wife he had. And he also knew the kind of character Joseph had. But so now Joseph is in prison. And verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him, and he granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And the warden put all the prisoners who were in prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that he'd done there. And the warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority, but the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful. Now again, you kind of have to think about how life was for Joseph back then. He didn't have a choice. But you also kind of, to me, have to kind of wonder, why did, again, if Joseph tried to rape his wife, why wouldn't he execute him? Potiphar could have done it. A slave had no rights. They had no appeals. Another thing is, notice that God is prospering everything that Joseph does, regardless of where Joseph is. Now, understand this, it's subjective, isn't it? We're going to see later that Joseph never ever lost sight of where he come from. The loss of that. He never lost. In other words, that was never his home. Even though he could say, well, life is pretty good. I'm running the prison. Well, again, that's subjective. What does that really mean? Well, it's better than being a prisoner. It's better certainly than being in the flogs and the jails and all that. But he still was a slave. He still was in prison. He went from being a slave to being in prison, to a prisoner. And in each case, God exalted him. All right, so now we're going to go to chapter 40. And it says, after this, the Egyptian king's cupbearer and the baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. Then the captain of the guard assigned Joseph to them, and he became their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. So Joseph kind of was there. You can not slave, but notice they were still in high positions under the king. Verse 5: the Egyptian king's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. Now, one of the things we're beginning to see is God laying the seed work for his plan and purpose. And of course, what we're going to see is why Joseph is in prison anyway, or why he's there in the first place. And it's all for God's plan. Not the greatest, right? In other words, but when I say greatest, it's great from God's perspective. When I say great, not the greatest, I'm talking about from Joseph's experience, right? He's like, well. But we're seeing him lay the seed. They have a dream. And Verse 6. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. So he asked the Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? We had dreams, they said to him, but there was no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Now, this is certainly true, since God was the one who gave them the dream. Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. In my dream, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed and came out, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. This is the interpretation Joseph said to them. 3 branches of 3 days, in just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup, in just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, the way you used to when you was cupbearer. But when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, even where I have done nothing that they should put me in this dungeon. Now, a couple of things about this, because this is, you see this dream that he's telling them. This is the foundation of God's plan. I want you to pay attention to the statement that Joseph makes. He said, when all goes well for you, then please remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. Even here, I've done nothing that they should put me in a prison. So I want you to see he's never forgotten that. That's still in his heart. Even though you can say for a slave, for a prisoner, he is doing well, but it's still not enough. Let me finish this, and I'm going to come back to this point about dreams here. So this dream was very nice for the cupbearer. So then, verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was positive, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. 3 baskets of white bread were upon my head. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the baskets on my head. This is interpretation, Joseph replied. The 3 baskets of 3 days, and in just 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from off of you and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh from your body. Oops. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all of his servants. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as a cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But Pharaoh hung the chief baker, just as Joseph has explained to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And of course, that becomes sort of the saddening thing here. Now, a couple of things I want to say about this was that, how did Joseph know, right? And this is important because we have a lot of people today claiming to give prophecies, claiming to give words of the Lord, claiming to see visions and all that kind of stuff. Well, first and foremost, Joseph knew because God revealed it to him. And then the fruit of that was it came to pass. And if you notice, every true prophet, a person that is speaking on God's behalf will always speak the truth. Which means, think about it, he had to deliver bad news to the baker. Now you think about a lot of the people prophecies today. Where is the truth? Where is the consistent truth today? And if you claim that God is using you to deliver a word from him, he is going to reveal it to you. So there's no cause in that. In other words, if you're, there are many false prophets in these people today, but I do digress. The sad news, of course, Joseph would have to wait. He tried to plead, hey, remember me. In other words, and think about this, he's given the right message to the right one. He doesn't give it to the baker. It's like to the baker, not too good for you. But to the cupbearer, remember me. Well, in some respects, he will remember, but we'll see that in the next chapter. He will remember, but it would be another 2 years. Think about that. It'd be another 2 years. And in the meanwhile, Joseph has the anguish of being away from his father. He has the anguish of being wrongfully convicted. He has the anguish of suffering in the prison for something he did not do. But the greatest thing about Joseph is that he always kept his view on God. And that's why he wasn't bitter and hateful. And we see that in the next study. All right, guys. I'll see you in the next study. See you then.